Peter Baker is the chief White House correspondent at the New York Times, great newspaper, and he's a terrific correspondent. And Peter, you and I have crossed paths, I think, from Russia to Afghanistan and Iraq and in Jerusalem. And you really have bitten into a big news cycle now, haven't you, in Washington?
Yeah, who would have thought, Dana, that those would have been the good old days, right? But yeah, it's a pretty crazy time here in Washington.
Yeah, it makes a war zone look a bit calmer.
It does, oddly. There's a certain, at least, logic to some of the things we would see in various places around the world. And here, it just feels like everything's kind of out of control.
Do you kind of feel like you're just reeling from one crisis to another? I mean, Trump is able to take a gust of wind and polish it up into a hurricane almost daily, it looks like.
Yeah, you can't keep track of all the big stories. And sometimes you realize that the big story that felt like months ago was just actually yesterday. We're moving on from, a global pandemic that here has killed 140,000 people to economic collapse. New unemployment numbers today are terrible. But we've also got now federal police in the streets of cities that don't want them. We've got a president bragging about taking a cognitive test. It's just, it's a nonstop news marathon, and it's hard to keep up.
I did an interview with a very well-known Democrat pollster, admittedly, but Stan Greenberg knows his stuff. And he was saying he doesn't think Trump's going to get reelected, that he's been abandoned by huge swaths of working women, people of race, all kinds of Republicans. I mean, it doesn't look pretty when you take a look at his demographics right now.
No, it really doesn't. He's behind by double digits in almost all the polls, and he's an incumbent president. You can't find in history going back an incumbent president who has been so far behind and come back to win since Harry Truman in 1948. Very different circumstances, of course. Doesn't mean he can't. It doesn't mean that he won't. Things can change. What we've seen change in the last 100 days, the world has changed so much. Who knows what's going to happen in the next 100 days? But all the fundamentals right now are not looking good for the president.
All right, so he's got a new issue. I mean, it looks like he's been listening to focus groups or something, I'm guessing, but law and order. He's tweeting it. He's talking about it. He's sending, men in fatigues, federal forces into Portland to start with, and it looks like he's going to expand that with no name tags, snatch and grab off the streets in cases. I mean, I don't think anybody has seen that in the history that I can think of in the U.S. when you talk about First Amendment rights.
Well, it's hard to think of a direct parallel, but you're right. I mean, and what's interesting, of course, is the president himself is talking about it in strictly partisan political terms. When he talks about the need to recapture control of the streets, he makes a point every time of saying these are cities led by liberal Democrats. And then he makes the connection to his own race in the fall, saying, if you elect Joe Biden, America will not be safe. So he himself is making this a very political exercise, which I think is one of the reasons why it's become a confrontation rather than, any kind of federal state cooperation to manage any issues that might be legitimate and might need to be addressed. And that's where we are right now with 100 days toward the election. Everything is political, everything is partisan, and it's just a very divisive moment.
How do you see it? I mean, the left is saying this is an infringement of our rights. These people are peacefully protesting and taking out their anger and their emotions after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. On the right, it's lawlessness. People are rioting. They're burning buildings. The president has to get involved. The truth is surely, definitely in the middle somewhere.
Yeah, look, most of the protests we've seen in this country over the last 6 weeks have been peaceful. Most of the protesters, I was at them in Washington, most of them were just trying to make a political point. But there are those who have gotten violent, and there are those who have gotten confrontational with the police, and they've gotten, damaged buildings and so forth. It's not the majority. It's not even close to the majority, but it has obviously created a great deal of visceral images on TV. The president is focusing on that and sort of conflating it all as if they're all rioters, they're all anarchists. And that's, of course, to his political advantage, he thinks, because he thinks that it will turn off voters outside of those cities and say, well, we need to stick with a strong president who's going to protect us from Antifa or other, radicals.
Right, and you have the local governors and the state governors, and you have the mayor saying that he's absolutely making it worse. This isn't what they want.
Yeah, exactly. This is not a situation where the president is saying, hey, do you need my help? I'm willing to send some folks who would help you out. This is a situation where he's trying to override the local elected leaders, and he's trying to, superimpose his own judgment over them. it's a very, very inflammatory situation right now. The mayors and governors are saying, we don't want you. We don't want you to come in, especially on a separate chain of command where we don't have any connection with what's going on here. We'll sue, some of them are saying, if you do, and it's just become a very volatile moment.
What's the pothole down the road? How dangerous can this get as we approach November and he starts using federal forces against, not against state authorities, but intervening without being invited?
Yeah, there are all kinds of, dangerous scenarios here that could get out of hand, no question about it. And we're also conflating different things. We're talking about, there are some in Portland, they're talking about protecting federal buildings and quelling demonstrations. In Chicago, they're talking about crime, just basic crime, not demonstrations or political events. These are different kinds of scenarios. The crime issues in Chicago are very different than, public demonstrations in Portland, but they're all being conflated together as if the cities are somehow out of control back in the 1960s and 70s kind of way, and that you have a law and order president like Richard Nixon talked about being back in that period.
And you have some of these new campaign ads that have come out with a burglar entering an old lady's home, and she's sitting there watching, watching the nightly news, I guess, and she calls 911, and there's no answer because of police defunding. I mean, that seems pretty torqued politics.
Well, it's the politics of fear, of course. It's not the first time that's happened. We've seen ads like this in many elections in which crime has been an issue. It's often a play to voters' fears, but it's also a reflection of the fact that voters are split themselves about this. Polls show that they're very supportive of the Black Lives movement, Black Lives Matters movement as a concept, at least. The idea that there is racial injustice that needs to be addressed here, and that the police need to be reformed. At the same time, most of the public doesn't support ideas like defunding the police, and that either needs to be explained better, or it needs to be or it's just not going to be getting support of the majority, because most don't feel that's a good idea. And that's what the president is talking about. He's trying to say, look, this would be the consequence if you defund the police. And that, I think, plays to the fears that a lot of Americans have about that.
Is this a minefield for Joe Biden if he doesn't handle it right?
Well, it is. But Biden's strategy so far has been basically, to stay out of sight. I mean, he's giving some speeches and he's doing some talks, but basically he's winning by not really being out there very public. And I think at first Democrats were concerned that the COVID pandemic meant that he wasn't going to be seen enough. And now they realize he's winning with a double-digit lead, even though he's not being seen. And so why mess with a strategy that seems to be working? At some point this fall, he'll be more visible. It'll be, the question is whether it becomes a referendum or stays a referendum on Trump, or becomes a choice between Trump and Biden. That's what the president wants. He wants the latter. He wants to make it a choice, and then to try to tear down Biden and tell voters, look, the other choice is no good.
Do you think that the problem with crime and Trump saying that he is the solution to law and order, do you think that is going to somehow make his mishandling of COVID-19 fade, or is that going to be the prime, the prime issue in the election in November?
I think he'd rather talk about, violence in the streets and his law and order view of things than the COVID. No question about it. Polls show, though, that the coronavirus is the #1 issue for Americans right now, and it's just sweeping through parts of the South and the West in terrible numbers, worse than it were in terms of number of cases than they were in March and April when we thought we were at the peak. And so I think that's still the dominant issue, because it affects so much. It affects the economy, it affects the ability of kids to go to school, it affects so many things. And you see the president, in effect, acknowledging that that's the case by resuming these daily televised briefings. He'll have another one today, in which that sort of acknowledges that it's not going away the way he was trying to tell us for weeks it was.
And you have to sit through those.
Yeah, absolutely. Although they're tighter these times. He's trying to make not as sprawling and rambling as they were in the spring. We'll see if it sticks to that. But the last two he's had have been relatively disciplined, at least for him. Ending in about half an hour without going too far afield.
Last question. Do you think that November is going to be a violent time? Are you worried about how this election is going to play out based on how polarized the two sides are right now? And there's a lot of things going on in the street.
I think it's a very volatile moment and a very unpredictable moment. Most elections, have certain rhythms and structures that you can kind of, recognize patterns from the past. and you can make predictions or judgments, if you will. This one is so, it's against the backdrop of so much uncertainty. Will people feel comfortable even going to the polls if the virus is out there, ravaging the country the way it is now? How will mail-in voting work? The president is already sort of setting the stage, challenge the legitimacy of the election by making unfounded, completely false claims about fraud that hasn't happened and isn't true, in order to basically explain away, presumably, if he doesn't win. And that's going to cause a great deal of consternation in the country too. Will the election be viewed as legitimate? Will the president himself accept the results, particularly if the results aren't favorable to him? And what will happen with his supporters if he doesn't? It's a very, very uncertain moment here.
Peter, you're a great journalist, and I really am honored with your time. I appreciate it so much. It's good to see you again and great to talk to you.
Well, it's great to see you too. And I miss our days together, and I wish you all the best there. I hope you stay safe and stay healthy.